Good evening, students. Welcome to this penultimate lecture on research and publication ethics. So far, we have done quite a bit on this subject, and especially during the last lecture, we discussed an important aspect, which is authorship, and also the problems and issues which come up when you consider authorship in manuscripts and authorship in conference presentations. So we also saw what kind of problems are there and case histories in authorship misconduct, and we have seen several such examples the last lecture. So today we move on the same topic a little bit. So yeah. So we move on and discuss a little bit more about authorship issues, and then also see this topic on complaints and appeals. So last lecture, I showed you this slide wherein when you submit a manuscript to a journal, so what does the editorial people at the journal do? One thing is that most of these well-established journals have very highly experienced people as editorial staff. So by looking at a manuscript, they have somehow some sixth sense which tells them in case there is some issue with the, in case there could be some issue with the manuscripts. So some typical pointers I had listed out last lecture. Things like language quality in the manuscript. Suppose it doesn't match with, say, an earlier publication by the same author, or even the covering letter which is sent along with the manuscript. Then suppose once if the manuscript has been reviewed, and then the reviewer comments have been sent to the authors, and if the corresponding author doesn't seem to respond back immediately or even after the given within the given time, so that shows some sign of a problem with the authorship. Then also when a manuscript has been drafted or revised by someone who is not on the author list or even acknowledged. So this is something what is called a ghost authorship. This typically happens in the field of medical sciences, actually, because medical sciences are also largely funded by the pharmaceutical and other industries, and so much so that they have tried to push down their agenda through publications and things like that. So they try to somehow manipulate authors into writing what they would like in the manuscript. And then the issues like tracking of the manuscripts, and it shows that there are some authors have been removed in the review process, or some authors have been added. So that also shows that there could be some issues here. There could be a genuine reason also, like for example, during the process of a review, you happen to do some extra experiments at some other lab, then it is but natural to include those particular people concerned with those experiments also. So you may have to change the author list. So that could be genuine also. Then also sometimes they have what is called an impossibly prolific author. So if they happen to see a particular name which is occurring consistently without much of contribution, so that also indicates there could be some issue here. So someone is trying to force through his power, force his name in the authorship list. Then then again, there could be some changes in the authorship without informing the editorial office during the review and revision stages. Then there are several such points which I had shown, and of course this has been taken from the COPE website, and one can see this if you're interested. So we come back to the question about what can the journals do whenever authorship issues come up. So I had also told you about 4 authorship criteria. That means there are 4 criteria under which a person can be qualified as an author or a contributing author to a manuscript. And these are typically that one should have a substantial contribution to the work. Then it should also be possible that all versions of the manuscript are approved by everybody. Then there was I think there was a case of everyone should know what the other contributors are exactly contributing into the work and things like that. So there was 4 such criteria which I had listed out. And so to be an author, one has to satisfy these 4 criteria. And these were actually laid down by the ICMJE, and largely starting from the medical journal side. Of course, there have been revisions or reviews of those 4 criteria, and McNutt et al. They have given a slightly broader interpretation to these 4 criteria, and we'll now see what this is. So first of all, one has to set standards for authorship. That means the journal has to ensure that authorship standards are followed. And how can they ensure that authorship standards are followed by people? So as I said, this ICMJ criteria should be followed, or this McNutt's criteria, where each author is expected to have made substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, and data acquisition, data analysis, or interpretation of data, or should have drafted the work or substantially revised it. See, there's a play of words here. Now, the earlier ICMJ criteria had the conditions and, but here there's a small change where it has been changed to or. So you can see that difference here. And then to have approved the submitted version or any substantially modified version that involves the author's contribution to the study, and to have agreed both to be personally accountable for the author's own contributions and to ensure that questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work, even ones in which the author was not personally involved, are appropriately investigated, resolved, and the resolution is documented in the literature. So that's another point which has been put in. Then the next point is that journals should actually provide some expectations for the corresponding authors. Who is the corresponding author? I think this point was raised in the last lecture, at the end of the last lecture. So this corresponding author is a person, actually, he must ensure that all listed authors have approved the manuscript before submission, and that all authors receive the submission and all substantive correspondence with the editors, as well as the full reviews whenever they come in. And the corresponding author should be also responsible for managing these requirements across the author group. When you say across the author group, that means not only within his own group, but in case there are collaborators within the institute or outside of the institute. So he has to be responsible for managing all these requirements across the entire author group, and ensure that the entire author group is fully aware of and in compliance with the best practices in the discipline of publication. And many journals actually require the corresponding authors to indicate whether any authors on earlier versions have been removed or new authors have been added, and why. So, as I said, all authors should have approved the manuscript, and the correspondence with editors should be carried out by the corresponding author. And also, he has to ensure that the original data and the materials used in the study or the codes, computer codes, are all preserved following the best practices in that particular area, and uh, and these are preserved for any future retrieval in case they are required. Then the corresponding also should confirm that the data presentation in the manuscript actually represents the original data which has been collected or acquired during the research work. Okay. Then, of course, there are certain other criteria, especially regarding the authors who are in and out in different versions. So why should that happen? So one point was the ghost authorship, which I talked about last time. So the corresponding author must confirm that all who deserve authorship are actually listed as authors. And then any conflict of interest declarations have been made. Then I think the journals also should impart ethics training in collaboration with universities and research institutions to the authors in this regard. Then the guest or gift or honorific authorships. So these are typically, you gift an authorship to a person whom you feel that would add value to their manuscript. So the journals actually should require each author have a transparent, identified, and legitimate role in the research. So they should not be people who are just there for the ornament's sake. Then orphan authorships, and the corresponding author must confirm that all who deserve authorship are listed. Okay, no one is kept out from the author list. And again, here there has to be some amount of training in ethics, which should be imparted to all people in the universities and research institutions. Then finally, this forged authorship, which I have talked about, where you include names of people without informing them or without taking their consent. Okay. And how do you avoid this problem? This problem is avoided when the journal contacts all the authors listed in the manuscript to confirm whether they acknowledge their contribution to the present work. So this is how the journals should also be interactive and then try to solve the issues. Okay. Then there's a new thing called contributor roles taxonomy. It's called credit. So both the journals as well as the authors should commit to the use of this system, which is called credit. And what does this credit system do? Basically, you extend this taxonomy. What is taxonomy? Basically, some nomenclature. Okay, so you can embed the each author's individual contribution in the metadata which is present at the end of the manuscript. Okay, so what do you mean by this metadata? Metadata data which concerns issues like all this ethics, etc., but they're not concerning the actual intellectual or scientific part of the manuscript. So this credit taxonomy is something now which is now becoming almost mandatory for all journals. So it is something like this. So you have a set of authors, and against each set of authors, you have certain terms. So this is the taxonomy: conceptualization, methodology, software. Then Priya Singh, data curation, writing, original draft preparation. Wu, visualization, investigation. Janssen, supervision. Then Kumar, software and validation, like that. So these are what are called taxonomies. And this credit system, contributor roles taxonomy system, has actually enumerated 14 such taxonomies. And these 14 taxonomies are given, so I'll try to see if it comes up a little later. And then all authors should require to adopt ORCID IDs. What is this ORCID? Basically, it is Open Researcher and Contributor ID. So, so these standard identifiers, they actually identify authors across different platforms. That means once you have an ID like this, and you put that ID, include that in the manuscript, and maybe you're forced to include it in the manuscript. If you don't have an authorship ID, you must acquire one authorship ID and then put it along with your name on the manuscript. So once you do this, all papers across different journals where you are an author, they'll get linked up to this authorship ID. So basically, journals should require that authors must have an author ID and then include it in the author metadata and all article presentations. So, for example, this is an example of an author ID. So, against these two names, you can see this green dots, and that indicates the it's a code. It's an identification code which is unique to each author. And if you happen to click on this code, you can simply get all the papers which are articles connected with this author name. These are the 14 credit taxonomies which I was talking about. So we have first one is conceptualization, where it involves ideas, formulation or evolution of overarching research goals and aims. Methodology involved. So development and design of the methodology which has been used for that particular work. Then software, any codes which have been developed as a part of this particular research work. So that is one of the taxonomy there. Validation. So that means verification, whether as a part of the activity or separate or the overall replication, reproducibility of results and experiments and other research outputs. Like that, we have formal analysis. So analysis of the data, then investigation. So research and investigation, performing the experiments, data collection, etc. Resources. So provision of study materials, then raw materials, and then in case your study requires human patients, then laboratory samples, animals for research, instrumentation, computation resources, and all those resources. Then data curation. So what does this mean? Management activities to annotate, scrub, and maintain data and maintain research data. See, for initial use as well as later use. So nowadays, preservation of data is very important. You cannot simply delete or throw away data once an experiment or paper is published, because there could be issues which will be coming up later, and you may be asked to provide the data, the raw data to the journal in case it requires some investigation. Then writing and original draft. So that itself is a taxonomy where it means preparation and presentation of the published work. Then specifically writing the initial draft. Then writing which involves review and editing. So there are two different activities here. First one is the original draft writing, and then the second one is review and editing. Both are equally important. Because the person who may write the first original draft may not be that proficient in, say, English. So it may need another author who may actually do the review and editing. Then visualization, so preparation of graphs and all those things. Then supervision, of course, is like a supervisor or PhD guide who does all the supervision and leadership takes the leadership responsibility of the research. Then project administration. This is also a quality where a person who actually takes care of overall management and coordination of a research activity. And then funding acquisition. So funding is also an important thing, because a person who garners funds for the research work is also is very important. So these are the 14 taxonomies listed under the credit taxonomy. So whenever you prepare a manuscript with some set of authors, so you have to assign one of these taxonomies to each of those, one or more of these taxonomies to each of those authors. So, so one such contribution statement you can see here. This is the journal and title of the paper, and these are the authors. So you can see how each author has contributed to the work. So for example, SG and DB, so SG happens to be the first and second authors, conceived the idea and designed the experiments. Then SG prepared the samples and characterized them by laboratory X-ray diffraction, etc. Then again, SG and DB wrote proposals and carried out experiments at the synchrotron X-ray facilities. Then BG happens to be somewhere here. This author has carried out laboratory X-ray diffraction experiments across some certain temperature range. Then these three authors have carried out powder neutron diffraction experiments. And then SG refined the diffraction patterns using inputs from others. And this person carried out first principle density functional theory based calculation. And all the authors have discussed and contributed in writing the paper. So this kind of a author contribution statement is now being routinely asked by most of the journals. So that later, whenever a journal has been reviewed and accepted for publication and later published in the journal, it is clear and transparent which of these authors has done what in this scientific research work, resulting in this paper. So that becomes very clear to whoever who reads this author contribution list. So now I discuss some author conduct cases involving how authorship misconduct can happen. And again, these are taken from the Cope case histories. And these are some of them very, very interesting. I mean, you may not have imagined that such things could happen when a paper is published. So here, what has happened, a journal received a request for multiple changes to the authorship list after the manuscript was accepted. So till that point, nobody raised any point at all. But once the manuscript was accepted, people started having different ideas. So originally, there were 5 co-authors. And after the acceptance, the journal received the following request from author A, who was the corresponding author, and the first author. And what was the request? Remove one of the co-authors, say author D, and add a new co-author, author E, and reorder the list of authors and change the designated co-first authors. So now this is something very strange as well as serious at the same time. So then the publisher explained that before processing any authorship changes after the article is accepted, the consent of all co-authors is required. And so what happened? All authors except the person who was supposed to be removed, they responded promptly. Okay. But the response from author D was somewhat suspicious. It was from an unfamiliar email address, which was not the one provided at the time of submission of the manuscript, and the text of that letter reply matched verbatim with the response from the author A. And given these peculiarities, the publisher quickly replied to author D, asking if he or she could reiterate their consent to the proposed changes, preferably via an institutional address. So you see how important having an institutional email address becomes here. Now, author D never responded even after sending a follow-up message. So what to do? The author A went on insisting on the changes, but then eventually said that to avoid further delays, publisher could proceed with the publication using the current author list. And the article was published. But after that, after publication, author A contacted the publisher again, claiming that there had been a misunderstanding and that they still wanted at least author E to be added. So they have slightly toned down their demand. They said, okay, you don't remove author D, but you must include author E now. So the publisher reiterated that consent from author D was still outstanding, and even for that one change. And author A again chased author D, and the publisher suddenly received a follow-up email stating that they agreed to be removed as co-author. So this is again very suspicious. However, that email was even more suspicious, and the third non-institutional email address was introduced, and the spelling of author D's first name changed between the second and third email addresses. And the spelling of author's D surname in the body of the third email did not match any of the email addresses, any of the prior correspondence or the published article. So the publisher suspects the corresponding author actually forged both of these author D's responses. And so nothing was done and the case was closed. So you can see, I mean, to what extent people go to change or deny credit and things like that. So here you see what is playing in here is the human mind, the fallacies of human mind. Okay, so this is not just science or scientific reasoning behind all this request. It's basically behind these demands. It's basically the fallacies of human minds and inability to cooperate or things like that, which causes these kind of issues. And what does this case say? On submission of a manuscript to a journal, one of the authors was indicated as the corresponding author. Now, during the submission, review, and revision process, and also through copy editing and proofreading, the corresponding author responded to all emails, signed the publishing agreement, and was generally available all the time. Now, at this time, the authors of the manuscript did not mention any possible change of the corresponding author. The manuscript was published online as an article in press online first, without a volume or issue number, but with a DOI number. But 5 months after the paper was published online, the authors of the manuscript asked the journal to change the corresponding author, but provided no clear explanation. So then again, the journal has to find out, I mean, they cannot just like that change any order or change the corresponding author just like that. So then they sent an email to all the authors and asked why the corresponding author name has to be changed. Now, only one of the authors responded, and the same person who asked for the change of the corresponding author. So in that person's response, the author said, during the submission process, they had indicated that the corresponding author should be another person from the list of co-authors, but however, from journal submission system, the editor could not verify this. So they said something in the air. And then the author also stated that during the proofreading process, they did not notice that the corresponding author was incorrect. So these are all real excuses. And that is why they contacted the editor. Then the author then stated that changing the corresponding author was not very important and the request could be ignored. Okay. As this request seemed to be confused and unclear, the editorial board decided not to change anything and keep the corresponding author as it was. So these are also, again, you can see how people, I mean, if they don't have trust or confidence among themselves and no clear, transparent agreements between themselves, how these fights can start coming up. And this can happen in any group, anywhere. Then the next case is a manuscript was submitted to a journal, and after the review and revision process, submitted manuscript was actually accepted for publication. Now, during this revision process, the corresponding author was in contact with the journal. He answered all the emails and performed the revisions of the manuscript, prepared answers to the comments of the referees, etc. But when the manuscript was accepted for publication and the corresponding author was asked to review the final revision of the manuscript, that means you generally, at the final stage, before it goes for publication, you get what is called a proof of the manuscript. Okay, so one has to okay the manuscript, and that has to be done by the corresponding author. So at this point, the corresponding author simply stopped answering emails. And the journal tried to contact the corresponding author several times and also tried to contact the co-authors and the university, but no response has been received. So here we have a case where the manuscript has been reviewed and accepted and ready for publishing. But the journal is now unable to contact any of the authors of the manuscript. So the COPE forum advised not publishing the paper if the editor does not have the final consent from the authors. The main reason for not proceeding with the publication is that if issues arose with the paper after publication, the authors would need to be contacted, especially if the editor does not have access to the raw data. Okay, so here you see raw data can be asked by the journal. So please, whenever you do your experiments, keep a good record, keep a safe record of all the data and the methodology involved. And the authorship implies responsibility for the research presented in the paper. If authors are not responding, then no one is taking responsibility for the work, and therefore the paper cannot be published. The paper should not be published without corresponding author's final approval. So finally, what happened was the journal received no response from the authors and then decided to withdraw the manuscript. You see how tragic is this case. So a situation where everything was accepted, approved, and ready for publication. At that stage, there was some misunderstanding between the authors, and then the whole thing had to be simply shut down. And then the next case involves an author who submitted a manuscript and stated that he was the sole author. Okay, a single author. The manuscript received favorable peer review and eventually was accepted. But sometime after it was published also. Sometime after it was published, a co-author told the author to contact the journal to correct the author list. Now the author of record did this and supplied co-author names to the journal. Okay, so this is after the manuscript was published under a single author. There was something which happened behind the scenes, and then suddenly some co-author came up and influenced the author to write to the editor and include his name as a co-author. Now the editor worked with the author group to determine the source of the error and to resolve the list and order of authors. The author of record, that means the person who first sent the manuscript, he acknowledged that he should have credited additional authors, and all authors agreed with the corrected list of authors, but the author of record insisted on being the first author, and the other authors did not agree. So these are all again typical human tendencies and human instincts which come in here and try to destroy good relationships. So pursuant to COPE guidelines, the editor contacted the university of this first author, whoever first corresponding author, for assistance, and found that the author had left the institution and was now a resident of another country, and the university was unable to assist in resolving the authorship issue. So then this author contacted the journal and stated due to disagreement on the order of authorship, he was now requesting a retraction of the article. So it has now gone to that extent where he has actually requested a retraction of the article from the journal. So I already told you what a retraction involves. It's a very detailed process, and basically it's a waste of time for everybody if a paper is retracted. So one more attempt was made by the editor and a co-author to resolve the dispute, but the AOR, or author of record, refused to acknowledge any lead author. But however, he agreed that following retraction, the manuscript will be resubmitted with another lead author. Now, attempts to negotiate another solution and education about consequences of retraction were unsuccessful in resolving the problem. And the forum agreed that the editor followed correct procedure in terms of handling this case, and is not the role of publishers or editors to resolve authorship disputes. So this is very important to know this. So the journal chose to republish the article with the corrected author list and a corrigendum. So the corrected article has been published online and will later appear in a print issue of the journal. So that was the final decision which was taken. Then there's another case where the review process for a manuscript, during the review process, one of the reviewers alleged that the manuscript appeared to be the work of a collaborator. The reviewer has actually alerted the editor. So it appeared to be the work of a collaborator, say X, who was not listed an author on the paper. So here you see how proactive the reviewer sometimes can be. The reviewer immediately knew the work, he knew who were the people who did the work, And then he felt that one person who did most of the work was not there as an author in this manuscript. So it became clear that the manuscript's corresponding author, some Y with some affiliation A, was actually a postdoctoral researcher who was supervised by this person X, was previously at this Institute A, and who recently moved to some other Institute B. Now, a third researcher Z was an author on the manuscript and at an institution in a different country. So the editors asked this person X whether he or she was aware of the manuscript from their postdoctoral researcher, who was Y. So this Dr. X, he says that he was not aware, and he stated that Dr. Y was actually funded solely by his own grant, and that they were working on a similar manuscript for submission elsewhere. And he also requested that the journal withdraw the paper. So then the journal editors, they asked Dr. Y to confirm whether the author list on the paper was complete and to provide the journal with the funding details. Then this Y replies that there were no other authors and the work was completely self-funded. So you can see the audacity of this person to say these kind of things. So then the editor updated the forum saying that the journal had contacted the author's institution, and it seems that the supervisor, Dr. X, is actually in the process of moving to a new institution, but is still at the same institution as the first author. And the department chair said that they will look into the matter. And the journal told Dr. Y that they had contacted the institution, and Dr. Y asked to withdraw the paper. So immediately we see put some pressure behind the scenes, what happened. The journal withdrew the paper as requested, but let the institution and author's postdoctoral advisor know that the paper has been withdrawn. The institution is actually still continuing their investigation. So finally, since Dr. X stated that they were working on a similar manuscript for submission elsewhere, withdrawal of the article seemed a reasonable response by the journal. Paper was withdrawn, and the editor contacted the institution and they said that they're conducting their own investigation. So you can see how sometimes it is the supervisor who could be the guilty person in trying to steal the work of the student or the postdoc, and sometimes the other way around, the postdoc is now trying to put one up on the principal investigator. And next case involves a single blind peer review process. The reviewer gave an author detailed suggestions about improvements in the statistical analysis. The author was asked to revise and resubmit the paper to address these and other reviewers' suggestions. So actually what has happened here is that the reviewer directly wrote to the author. And the author, who was unaware of the reviewers, these reviewer suggestions were sent to the author by the journal editor. But so happened the author, being unaware of the reviewer's identity, subsequently actually approached the reviewer as a respected colleague at a professional meeting. So the author had no idea that this person was actually the reviewer of his paper. But he knew that the reviewer happens to be in the same field of research, so he approached him in a professional manner, asking for advice in this revision of a manuscript. Now, during this conversation, to avoid having to pretend to go over their own suggestions as if they were from someone else, the reviewer here, he disclosed that he was one of the reviewers. So at this point, he disclosed it. Then the author and reviewer discussed how to improve the manuscript, and at this point, the reviewer offered to assist with new statistical analysis that they had recommended and become a co-author, which was agreeable to the author. But then, you see, there was a problem here. Before proceeding, the reviewer disclosed this interaction and her intention to the journal editors and the associate editor for handling the paper. So they made it clear, the reviewer made it clear that she already discussed this, because inadvertently the author had come to her and then discussed this project, this paper, and so they felt that they can no longer not disclose the identity, and then decided to work together. So what the editors did, So ideally, the reviewer should have contacted the journal to discuss the situation. So before the reviewer talked to the author, he should have first contacted the journal and discussed it. But unfortunately, the reviewer did not do that. So it seems, however, it seems a hard decision to reject the article because of an inadvertent scientific interaction between the researcher and the colleagues. So if the reviewer had contacted the journal, he or she could have actually recused themselves from the review process, and an independent reviewer could have been invited to review the paper. So the editors wrote back to the authors to offer the opportunity to resubmit the manuscript with the involved reviewer now as a co-author, after which it would receive a new independent review. But by the time this happened, the authors had already sent the manuscript somewhere else. So that ended the story. Then the next case actually is regarding, the journal was contacted with a claim that the first authorship of a paper currently published online. So this was the problem. What is the problem here? The problem is that someone contacted with a claim saying that he should have been the first authorship in the paper, which was published. It was online, not yet on print. So the print publication was put on hold pending the result of investigation. And the claim to the first authorship was based on the claimant stating that they had obtained most results published in the paper during their PhD studies under the supervision of the corresponding author and contributed to the writing of the text. So this is a case of a PhD student asserting that he or she should have been the first author in that paper. And this claimant provided evidence in the form of some screenshots of some email and etc. for that manuscript. So what happened? The corresponding author was immediately contacted and declared on behalf of all authors that the claimant had not contributed to the experiments or writing, and that none of the results shown in the article were actually performed by the claimant. They also explained that the claimant was discharged from the PhD program before the person could successfully complete it. And the claimant indicated that he or she wished to dispute this, and therefore the institution was then asked to investigate and then resolve the dispute. So what happened? The institution informed the journal that the knowledge generated during the state-funded projects was the property of the institution. It's not the property of anyone else. And only the institution has the ability to agree to a copyright transfer in agreement with the corresponding author, and the corresponding author had full legal and institutional support to determine the author list of the papers resulting from this project. They also stated that a graduate student may or may not be included as an author on the papers deriving from the projects to which they have contributed, and according to institutional guidelines. So these are guidelines of that particular institute, not all institutes. In order to be included as an author, the student must successfully complete the studies within a defined time frame. The institution did not comment on the extent of contribution of the claimant to the research results and the discussion which was presented in the published paper. So again, following advice from the COPE forum, the journal approached the highest authority within the university, to specifically confirm that the authorship of the paper was determined as per the standard criteria set by ICMG or COPE, which they said they did, and so no further action was taken. So this also shows that ultimately the institutions will assert their rights, and even though your person happens to be a student, the person has to remember that he or she has to work within the guidelines or the rules of the institution. And I think this is the last example where some Dr. X started her postdoctoral training under a fellowship. She worked on the project till 2014, after which the fellowship ended. She did all the work herself and gave 2 seminars showing her results, progress with the positive feedback. And when needed, she consulted with supervisor or with a senior scientist in the lab. And by the time she finished, she wrote a manuscript solely on her work, and it had gone through several rounds of revisions, etc., with the senior scientists. Now, there were 5 co-authors on the paper. Dr. X, who was the supervisor, Dr. X herself, the supervisor, and 2 senior scientists and a graduate student. And in 2015, the manuscript was sent to the supervisor, who had some remarks and received the final version in some October or something, with the understanding that he will submit it. But then this Dr. X never received any reply from the supervisor. And by that time, this person has been hired in a permanent research position. And to have a tenure in that position, she needs to publish and also show that her postdoctoral work was actually accepted for publication. So then the forum concluded that this person, the complainant, should submit the paper for publication. When X submits the paper to a journal for publication, she should be transparent about the provenance of the paper. That means basically you have to explain the history, who were involved, etc. And the supervisor's contribution and conflict of interest should be also documented on the paper. And if published, the editor could consider having a statement concerning these on the paper. So what happened, the researcher tried to determine the correct person to contact about the supervisors. She did not want to contact the supervisor again, but then she met with frustration. So again, this shows if the institution decides to close ranks, then once you're out of the institution, you cannot do anything with it. Okay. So that also is a very stark reminder on how these things work. Okay, so that was all with the author misconduct cases and things like that. So now let's see something about complaints and appeals. Okay, so okay, some of the earlier examples also involved complaints, but here I would like to discuss something about appeals during the publishing process when the manuscript has been sent for review, etc., and all those things. So what kind of problems you can face here, and how you can appeal against what you feel some injustice has been done to you. So what can be these complaints? Complaints may arise over the conduct of editors and or the peer reviewers. And what could these be? Breaches of confidentiality, undisclosed conflicts of interest, or plain misuse of privileged information. And these complaints can also arise from disputes about substantive decisions, such as retractions. And some others may be more administrative in nature, that is, irregularities in editorial processes or complaints that journal staff are unresponsive. So journals should therefore develop some guidelines for responding to these suspected ethical breaches. And so what are the typical causes for these complaints and appeals? Say, usually involves peer review. So peer review by external referees with the proper expertise is the most common method to ensure manuscript quality. However, editors or associate editors may sometimes reject manuscripts without external peer review itself to make the best use of their resources. So what does this mean? You send a manuscript to a journal and it comes back to you next day by the editor, from the editor, saying that, look, this particular manuscript does not fit or meet our journal requirements, so we cannot proceed further with this. So it does not even go ahead for a peer review also. So reasons for this practice are usually that the manuscript is outside the scope of the journal, does not meet the journal's quality standards, or is of limited scientific merit, or lacks originality or novel information. So this is a fairly frequent issue which is faced, especially by authors from the third world countries, like even India also. So whenever this happens, we as authors, we feel really aggrieved that the manuscripts have not been given a chance to be sent to the concerned reviewer or the expert. And sometimes probably even a non-expert in the editorial office might have simply decided that, look, this particular manuscript does not meet our criteria. It may not have so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so points. So then we'll simply return it. So this person may totally miss the significance of the manuscript. That's what we as authors feel whenever we get the manuscript thrown back at us the next day. So this could be one very usual issue which people face. So actually, what should the journals be really doing here? Actually, they should first designate a contact person for ethic inquiries and appeals and complaints. And editorial offices should focus on promptly correcting the literature, but request authors, institutions, or employers or funding agencies to investigate and follow up on author misconduct and discipline also. And they should also have a process for author appeals against editorial decisions. And they should have processes to investigate and manage editor, reviewer, or staff misconduct, so, like, for example, undeclared conflicts of interest. And when needed, they should also contact other journals or contact institutions of the authors, editors, reviewers, and seek independent or legal advice. And then, despite the editor's best effort to solicit fair and unbiased reviews to evaluate manuscripts fairly and to make decisions that are in the best interest of the journal and its readers, authors may still want to challenge editorial decisions. This is very common. So, to face this, the editors should have a policy in place to address these complaints and try to help and resolve these issues. Although it is not easy at all to explain to an author that the research reported in his manuscript does not warrant publication in comparison with many others under consideration. So you may also say, look, my manuscript is very similar to something else which has been published in your journal. So why are you rejecting my manuscript? So again, the editor has to give a proper reasoning here to the concerned author on why that particular manuscript has been rejected by that by his journal. So he should also determine whether this decision was clearly explained to the author and whether it may have been based on some wrong or questionable information. For example, on an incorrect reading of the manuscript or on bad advice from a reviewer. He should also reconsider rejected manuscript if the author provides good reasons why the decision may have been wrong and is willing to revise the manuscript in response to valid comments of the reviewers and editors. Many journals actually allow authors to write a rebuttal letter explaining why the manuscript should be re-evaluated. And they should also encourage resubmission of manuscripts that are potentially acceptable, but they were rejected because of some major revision or some additional data were required, explaining precisely what is needed to make the manuscript potentially acceptable and the process and procedures that will be followed in handling the resubmitted manuscript. So now we see some of the more popular journal publishing houses, how they address complaints and appeals from authors. So this is the publisher Springer. How do they address? So whenever there's a complaint about scientific content, so that means the manuscript had been rejected due to its scientific content, then the editor-in-chief or the handling editor considers the author's argument, the reviewer reports, and then takes a decision whether the decision to reject should stand or another independent opinion is required or the appeal should be reconsidered. And then the complainant is informed of the decision with an explanation, if appropriate. And these decisions on appeals are final, and new submissions take priority over these appeals. Now, if the complaint is about the processes, for example, the time taken for the review process, then what should the editor do? He should investigate the matter, and then he should also inform the complainant that, look, so-and-so thing had happened because of so-and-so reasons with the reviewer or something like that. And then also inform the reviewer that, look, you should not be taking so much time for a review process. It will hinder the author's genuine need to publish the results quickly. Then there could be complaint about publication ethics, like the researcher's conduct or the author's conduct or even the reviewer's conduct. These cases we have already discussed in the authorship misconduct cases and the other scientific misconduct cases, peer review cases earlier. So again, here the editor-in-chief may ask the publisher for advice on difficult or complicated cases, and they can decide on a course of action and provide feedback to the complainant. And if the complainant remains dissatisfied with the handling of this complaint, they can actually submit the complaint to the Committee on Publication Ethics, that is COPE. Now, the APS, American Physical Society journals like Physical Review or Physical Review letters. So here, what are the appeal procedures? So in these journals, when you submit a manuscript and you face a rejection, the authors can appeal this rejection by the editors. And in case of a formal appeal, the paper and all the relevant information, including the identities of the referees, will be sent to a member of the editorial board. And a board member may review the case on the existing record or may seek some additional expert opinion. And this board member will also present an advisory opinion to the editor, which will now be sent to the authors and or the referees with the board member's name. And then the authors may suggest those board members they feel they are appropriate or not appropriate to conduct the review, but the editor is not bound by such suggestions. And then if there is no suitable board member available, the editor can appoint an external person or a scientist to consider the paper as an ad hoc board member. So this is how the APS journals, they consider a review process. And the author of a paper that has been rejected subsequent to an editorial board review may request that the case be reviewed by the editor-in-chief of the APS, that is the topmost person. And of course, this request should be addressed to the editor of the journal, who will forward the entire file to the big boss, if he considers it appropriate. And of course, such an appeal must be based on fairness of procedures followed and must not be just a request for another scientific review. And the questions to be answered in this review are: were our procedures followed appropriately, and did the paper receive a fair hearing? And finally, the decision of the big boss, that is the editor-in-chief, is the final level of review. And Royal Society of Chemistry journals, they have also their appeals procedures. And so mostly they are all similar across all the journals with some minor variations here and there. So the Royal Society of Chemistry journals, they have a step-wise procedure. So step one is to send a rebuttal letter to the editor via the journal email. And the letter should clearly explain why you disagree with the decision and include a detailed response to any of the reviewer's comments. Then step two, editor will consider your appeal, and all appeal requests are handled on a case-to-case basis, and the editor's decision is final. And if your appeal is granted, the next step is that your manuscript will undergo further assessment by an independent reviewer. And then finally, the editor will make a final decision on the manuscript. So here in this case, there was a case where there was a plagiarism complaint. So author X of a paper actually published by Journal A complained to the editor-in-chief of this Journal A that his paper has been plagiarized by a paper that was published later by some other Journal B. Moreover, the authors of the paper in Journal B, they did not respond to letters sent by the first author X asking for an explanation for his apparent plagiarism. Now the editor-in-chief of the first Journal A, he compared the two papers, he confirms the plagiarism. Then he tries to contact the editor-in-chief of the second journal, but no response is received after several reminders. And no more successful were attempts made by the representative of the publishing house of the Journal A to contact any representative of the publishing house of the Journal B. And the author goes on asking what the Journal A is doing and when his paper has been plagiarized and published in Journal B. So Journal A is considering publishing either an expression of concern or a note of plagiarism on its paper that will inform the community that the paper in Journal A has been actually plagiarized by a paper in Journal B. So the problem is there's little that the editor can do in this situation when another journal, not under their control, refuses to reply or engage. So finally, what happened was that most probably this Journal B actually is a predatory journal, an unscrupulous journal. They don't respond to this request. Very often it happens that some journals, they simply take a paper in toto from some published journal and put it in their own journal with some different author list. There's no connection with the original. So this kind of things I'll be discussing in the next lecture actually. Okay, so finally, there's a very interesting editorial in the journal Nature Human Behavior. The title of the editorial is How Not to Appeal. So whenever you get a rejection of your manuscript, okay, it's always better to spend some time on it and worry why that particular manuscript actually has been rejected. You should also discuss with the co-authors on the issue, why the rejection happened, what would have made them reject the manuscript. And after going through all these things, all the authors still feel that yes, we can try and go for an appeal. Then, of course, one has to write an appeal, go for the appeal. But sometimes the reviewer, they want additional new data in the manuscript. They say that whatever you have provided is not enough. You must include some extra data of so and so nature. So you may not have that data, then you may have to actually do the experiment, okay? And you have to provide it in a reasonable time frame. And then finally, if you find that your own scientific grounds are strong enough, okay, for an appeal, then of course you can write a very measured, scientifically sound response and offering to clear any misconceptions in the whole process. And lastly, don't try to throw your weight around. See, it will not make any difference to the outcome, even if you're a Nobel Prize winner. Okay. So I hope you will be able to keep these points while in the course of your research work and whenever you publish your research. So I think we'll stop here and we'll continue tomorrow on the next topic, that is predatory journals and open access, a little bit open access journals. And what do you mean by open access publications and papers? Also, I'd like to, since it's going to be the last lecture tomorrow, we'll see if possible at the end of the lecture, if we can have some kind of short discussion in case you have any topics, etc., which covering the entire course of these lectures, in case you happen to have some very specific points for discussion, maybe you can actually do it at the end of the lecture tomorrow. So that's it for today. Thank you very much. Any questions in the chat? No? Okay, end. Let's check the YouTube one. Okay.